Okay, Svetlana, do you want to start our conversation?
Thank you, Katerina. Okay, hello everyone. On behalf of Ukraine Decolonial Studies Network, I am delighted to welcome you to today's event. This is the second event of our panel series. The first one took place in December of the past year, and we are planning to continue the series throughout the year 2026. Ukraine Decolonial Studies Network was founded in 2022 as a response to Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine and the necessity to conceptualize and to theorize the position of Ukraine in the world and particular aspects of Ukrainian contested history of the condition of Ukrainian society, and the necessity to put it in connection with the global condition and the ongoing processes that are ongoing internationally. So our association focuses on the development of thinking related to decolonial and post-colonial frameworks of thought, but also going beyond of this and involving a wider interdisciplinary and intercultural dialogue and communication. So I am very happy to open this event that is moderated by my colleague Katerina Yeremeyeva. And Katerina Yeremeyeva is a historian specializing in Soviet and post-Soviet humor, gender, and visual culture. She earned her PhD at the Karazin National University in Kharkiv with a dissertation on political humor in Soviet Ukraine. Her monograph, To Beat Satire, magazine Peres in the socio-cultural milieu of Soviet Ukraine, was supported by the Kowalski Foundation and the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies. She has held fellowships at Ludwig Maximilians University in Munich and is currently a fellow at the University of Basel. So, Katerina, the floor is yours, and welcome everyone.
Thank you so much, Svetlana, for this generous introduction. And hello to everyone who joins us today. And we are truly delighted to see such a strong international audience today. Welcome to our panel, Liberated Voices, Gender and the Decolonial Turn. So their discussion today brings together scholars and public intellectuals working at the intersection of gender studies, post-colonial and decolonial theory, sociology, history, literary, cultural analysis. And we welcome today Oksana Kis, Tamara Martsenyuk, Alex Averbukh, and Agnieszka Graff. So what about the general idea of this panel? We begin from a simple but urgent premise that gender is not a secondary lens, but a critical side of resistance within societies shaped by empire, systematic inequality, and war. And in this context of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, questions of voice, visibility, memory, political agency have become particularly premise. And feminist, queer perspectives will ask to rethink how these experiences are translated into knowledge. So this panel moves between present, recent past, and from sociological research on women's everyday lives during the war to feminist reading of Soviet repressions in the Gulag and queer literature, cultural practices that unsettle imperial and heteronormative models of belonging. And by bringing these perspectives into dialogue, we also aim to move toward broader methodological vision on one that extends beyond the Ukrainian case and invites reflection on how gendered and queer lenses can reshape colonial, decolonial scholarship across different contexts. So, and today's speaker will have up to 15 minutes for the presentation. After the individual talks, we will move into a conversation among the panelists, and then, if time allows, we will open the floor to questions from the audience. which you are welcome to post in the chat after all presentations. And if you have questions, comments, feedback, use our chat, but after all talks. And little reminder that our panel is recorded, and after the video, it will be open for even wider audience. And today, we will start with our first speaker, Agnieszka Graff, and Agnieszka is a Polish writer, translator, feminist scholar, human rights activist, and she lectures in gender studies at the University of Warsaw, and has long been one of the most prominent public voices on feminism, democracy, human rights in Poland. And she is an author of Road Without Women, nominated for the Nike Literary Award, and co-founder of the 8th March Women's Coalition in Warsaw. So, Agnieszka, the floor is yours. You're welcome.
Thank you very much. I come with a provocation. I'm a little worried now that I know we have such a broad audience, but I will blunder nonetheless. I also come to you as less an activist and more a scholar who has been engaged for over a decade and hopefully no more in the study of anti-gender movements. And that is really my departure point in this, in what I have to say today. My talk has the title, Can Decolonial Feminism Include Solidarity with Ukraine? And I really mean it as a question. I do not know the answer. I really want to know if there is room in decolonial feminism as it is currently practiced in the West and the global South for a robust and politically consequential critique of Russia's colonialism, and whether such an opening would lead to real solidarity with Ukraine. I do not think it is happening at present. I will be relieved if it does happen, and if it cannot happen, I really want to understand why. But these are open questions. In fact, I'm overstating my case in the hope of being proven wrong. So let's reflect on two related phenomena. The first is the gender component of Russian colonial expansion and the way this colonial expansion is being legitimized. And the second phenomenon, decolonial feminism's troubling lack of solidarity with Ukraine, and in fact, its obliviousness to the existence of Russia. So first, colonialism, coloniality, colonization, and decolonization. The Russian war on Ukraine, now entering, and this is pretty wild for me to realize, entering its 5th year, is not just a war of territorial expansion, but it is a colonial war, an extension of Soviet imperial projects and of Russia's imperialism that goes back centuries. It includes the extraction of natural resources, the erasure of local cultures. It includes genocide and atrocities in the realm of gender, which I will refer to in a moment. Meanwhile, Ukraine has also become the target of a new kind of American colonialism. Trump has made it clear that his plans are highly transactional and, in fact, extractionist rather than liberatory, and that his sympathy is more with Putin than with Zelensky. We've seen that unfold on our TV screens a few months ago. Ukrainian resources are expected as compensation for American aid. Mineral and oil resources have been reported to be part of the support discussions. And so this is a doubly colonial war. Now, the weird thing is that Russian colonialism presents itself as anti-colonial, an effort to counteract Western colonialism, and, as Sergei Lavrov has put it, to free the world from neo-colonial oppression of the West. This pseudo-decolonial discourse is aimed to court support for Russia's war on Ukraine from Africa, Asia, the Middle East. It also resonates in the West, strangely enough, both on the far right and on the left. On the right, as documented in a brilliant article by Miri Davidson, published in 2024, the anti-colonial frame is taken up by identitarian movements on the far right. Europe is presented as authentic culture under threat from colonizing forces. Of course, the migrants are the colonizers. On the left, this discourse is replicated by decolonial scholars, many of whom appear satisfied to ignore Russian imperialism and even to view Russia as their ally. The best known example of this is Walter Mignolo's famous decolonial scholar's statement in support of Putin's decolonial anti-Westernism. He identified Russia, along with China, and widely enough, Iran, as civilization states that are challenging Western hegemony. Clearly, Ukraine is expected to be collateral damage in this project of creating a de-Westernized world. Now, I do not insist that this is the only, and let alone the correct way to practice decolonial studies, but Mignolo's much critiqued statements on Russia are, I think, symptomatic of a much broader tendency, one that extends, sadly enough, to decolonial feminism. Madina Tlostanova has examined how decolonial language and concepts are appropriated, distorted, and flattened in Russian and post-Soviet discourse. She goes so far in her work as to argue that these abuses have turned decolonial discourse into an empty rhetorical tool divorced from any theoretical depth. It's a commodity rather than a critical project. I am not sure I agree. However, we do need to contend with the power of the Russian appropriation of decolonial discourse and its political consequences. The question that needs to be addressed is whether the decolonial frame can be reappropriated back, whether it can be taken back with the end of recruiting Western progressives to the Ukrainian cause. Or perhaps we don't care about Western progressives, we just want to use decolonial discourse to understand what's going on in the region. These really are open questions. Two, the gender component of Russia's expansionism and its decolonial rhetoric. There's no way to miss it. It's in your face, spectacular, at times grotesquely so. The gender component of Russia's expansionism, the macho posturing underwriting Putin's public image. The repeated suggestions in Russian propaganda that Ukraine is somehow effeminate, a girl in need of being raped. The prominent role played by anti-gender rhetoric in justifying the war, and the use of anti-gender moral panics in efforts to undermine the sovereignty of other nations, including Poland. Elżbieta Korolczuk, with whom I've co-authored the book on anti-gender movements, and I, at the beginning of the war, wrote an article in which we argued that anti-genderism is Russia's soft power, a way to soften the edge of what is going on in the real war. The fact, and another aspect of this gender component of Russia's war is war crimes that include rape of women as well as sexual violence against men and boys. 366 cases have been reported by mid-2025, as well as child kidnapping and torture. So, well, I don't need to elaborate on how that is related to gender. It's pretty clear. And on the other side, there is the commitment to women's rights as well as LGBTQ rights on the side of Ukraine's resistance to Russia, the visible presence of queer people in the armed struggle, and the army's commitment to gender equality. And by the way, some Western progressives who view themselves as decolonizers have critiqued these gestures of gender equality as homonationalism. So there is a kind of double or triple misunderstanding or maybe hostility going on here. But my point is simply this. Russia's war against Ukraine, and more broadly, Putin's imperial project, has a powerful anti-gender equality component, and this component is part of the anti-colonial posturing. Gender, in Putin's rhetoric, is a Western invention, a form of Western colonialism and the ongoing rise of anti-genderism globally is not exclusively, but to a large extent, a result of Russian efforts and Russian funding. Neil Datta's report, Tip of the Iceberg, published as far back as 2019, reveals much of what needs to be revealed in this regard. And yet the implications of these facts have not been taken up by feminist scholarship, decolonial or otherwise. Many scholars of anti-gender movements, and I'm speaking mostly of those working in the West, have insisted that anti-gender campaigns are an effect of the failures of Western liberalism, a legacy of Western colonialism, an effect of structural racism in Western societies. This way of thinking is not just counterfactual, and I'm not saying these things are not bad or problematic. I'm just saying that they are not the source of anti-genderism. So this way of thinking is not just counterfactual, but it is also the feminist variant of Maniolo's anti-Western, pro-Russian position. Russia, I want to argue, is decolonial feminism's blind spot. And I want to make my position very clear. I consider myself a decolonial scholar in the sense that I have worked with the decolonial theory for over a decade now. I have cited Anne McClintock's work on colonialism and sexuality in my work on gendered nationalism in Poland. I am indebted to Maria Lugonis's concept of the coloniality of power, of gender, which shows how modern gender systems are shaped often violently through colonial rule. I work in the American Studies Center, and so I have pretty deep knowledge, I think, of the African American history and its connection to feminism. And I have reconsidered my claims about Polish gender history by applying these insights to the colonial history of Poland, both as a colonized nation and one with colonial ambitions. Finally, I have followed work by Black feminists from the US and the Global South, which take to task Western feminism. And I'm thinking Mohanty, but also many other works in this regard, and applied them in my interventions in the women's, at the Polish Women's Congress, which is, at least at the beginning, was pretty naively liberal. So I've done all these things. I have benefited from all these studies, and I have seen many Ukrainian scholars do the same. In other words, in the region, there is a continued effort to apply decolonial feminism to our predicament. One interesting example I've been looking at is the Ukrainian decolonial glossary, which I found on the web, which is still work in progress, but already quite interesting and developed. And I was struck by the way that it applies Gayatri Chakravorty-Spivak's concept of gender subalternity to Ukrainian women's invisibility in the West. So there's this effort to twist this some of these invisibilities using their own underlying theorizations. And of course, this series and this event is another case in point. But what I have not seen, and maybe I'm not looking in the right places, please correct me if that is so, is intellectual movement in the opposite direction. I have not seen Western intellectual and activist networks known as decolonial feminism express solidarity with Ukraine. Nor have I seen them confront their own naivete concerning Soviet and Russian imperialism. In fact, I think there is a certain nostalgia, and I'll have an example for that, regarding Soviet engagement with the decolonial process. Now, I am not alone in this critique. Prominent Ukrainian feminist scholars, such as Tamara Martsenyuk and writer Oksana Zabushko, have stated that Western left and decolonial circles often fail to recognize Russia as an imperial power because anti-imperialism, as practiced by them, is aimed at the United States. Galina Kotliuk has examined the exclusion of Ukraine from post-colonial approaches, leading to what she calls a knowledge gap, a gap that includes the question of gender identities and roles in Ukrainian society. She argues that European societies view Ukrainians as orientalized passive objects, which in fact repeats the orientalizing gesture of Russia's ideology. Ruski mir. Teresa Hendel has written a powerful piece titled Towards Accounting for Russian Imperialism and Building Meaningful Transnational Solidarity with Ukraine. I mentioned this text, and it's you can access it in full online, and it's really worth reading, in which she speaks with great emotion about the disappointment of Eastern European feminists with Western feminism, and including Western decolonial feminism. She says, in many cases, these omissions have pushed us away and had us re-examine the feminist canon, including much of the canonized post- and decolonial scholarship, and motivated us to reconnect with each other, our scholarly work, traditions of thought, and social movements. Now, I agree with these assessments, and I have plenty of my own examples to add. What puzzles me is how unapologetically the exclusion of Russia as a colonial power is replicated, but also how easily it goes unnoticed in the East. And I suspect in Ukraine, it's not so easy to not notice, but in Poland, I've seen it go unnoticed. There's a kind of blind spot of the blind spot happening. Let me share one example. I've recently finished reading the Polish translation of Decolonial Feminism, a book by François Verge. I'm just going to flash the book here for those who want to know. The book does not even consider the possibility of addressing colonial struggles other than those between the West and the global South. In fact, it juxtaposes decolonial feminism with civilizational feminism, that is, Islamophobic, Western, white, neoliberal, and largely oblivious to its own colonial roots. Now, this frame works very well for France, but it largely equates coloniality as it functions today, as opposed to colonialism of the past, with structural race-based inequality in Western countries. Russia does not appear in this text at all, and the Soviet Union appears once as an ally of third world countries, when the proposal was made to declare the Decade of Women at the UN in 1975, an aim which she claims was later betrayed in the name of a kind of neoliberal discourse of human rights. Now, this book appeared in Polish with no preface and no afterword. So my question would be, how is it being assimilated into Polish feminist discourse? We can only look at the paratexts. And one of those is an extended interview with the author conducted recently by two doctoral students from Warsaw University. What I found fascinating about this discursive event is that they failed to ask her about her position on Russia. They're sitting in Warsaw, right, with instruction manuals on how to behave in case the war breaks out in all our mailboxes. And they don't ask her about Russia. They seem to accept for themselves the position of white and admittedly almost Western feminists who are asking a decolonial feminist, a woman of color, for advice on how best to face our responsibility for the colonial past, from which they agree Poland too has benefited because we are a European Union member. I'm almost done. Now, I leave it to you to unpack the ethical and political implications of this exchange, and especially the positionality of two Polish feminists in this regard, in which Eastern European position and the very existence of Russia are erased in the name of decolonial struggle. Decolonial feminism does not seem to acknowledge that Russia exists. So to conclude, is there any way to put Russian imperialism on the mental map of Western progressives? I think it's unlikely. I think there is a deep problem with the decolonial frame as such, with its implicit view of history and its political commitments. To put it bluntly, the problem is that Russia's strategic appropriation of the discourse of decolonization has a long history and has proven highly successful. It's based on a blatant lie, this self-presentation as an anti-colonial empire, but it has proven persuasive both left and right. Russia has somehow tapped into Western progressives' anti-Western sentiments. And so it hijacked the decolonial discourse, partly relying on the legacy of Soviet Union's reputation as an ally of decolonial forces. So it seems unlikely that Ukraine's plight as a colonized nation, a nation in the progress of being colonized, will somehow come to the attention of those committed to decolonial struggle in the West. Russia's imperial aggression has been repackaged as decolonial. This is not to say that decolonial theory cannot or should not be applied to Ukrainian experience. The operation might prove intellectually fruitful. I just doubt that it will be politically persuasive. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you so much, Agnieszka, for this thought-provoking, more than thought-provoking and discussion-provoking speech. And I suppose we return later to your suggestions, and we are going on. And our next speaker is Oksana Kis. Oksana Kis is Ukrainian historian and anthropologist specializing in women's history and gender in Ukraine. She is president of the Ukrainian Association for Research in Women's History and co-founder of the Ukrainian Oral History Association. Her book, Survival as a Victory, Ukrainian Women in Gulag, has been widely recognized as a landmark contribution to rethinking Soviet repression through women's experience. Oksana, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Katerina, for the introduction, and many thanks to Agnieszka for such a relative but very important introduction to our discussion. I have to confess that I had a hard time preparing for this discussion because I really struggled with how to best approach the questions we were asked to respond. And there are many issues I wanted to address and several dimensions I wanted to explore. I could list all of them, all those aspects, and briefly touch on each one, but I choose a few and try to make a deeper point. So I've chosen the latter, and I'll focus on two issues now. So first, I'll share my experiences and thoughts as a historian of Ukrainian women's lives and the extreme historical, specifically of those who survived the Gulag, to show how studying such gendered experiences could undermine the established Russocentric narrative of the Gulag. And then I'd like to offer my reflections as a scholar engaged in feminist and gender studies, and more specifically in women's history, who for more than 3 decades observed the dynamics of the field since the 90s in the context of development of post-Soviet and Central Eastern European studies in Western academia. So studying Ukrainian women's lives under extreme historical circumstances in times of genocidal famine, Holodomor, during the nationalist underground struggle against in 40s and 50s, and in political imprisonment in Stalin's Gulag was a truly eye-opening experience for me. Despite established perception of Ukrainian women's experiences historical calamities, predominantly in terms of their helpless victimhood or heroic martyrdom, I, to my great surprise, revealed women's grassroots agency and variety of manifestations of everyday resistance. If we make an effort to look closer at women's responses to major historical developments, our understanding of those events or phenomena might change drastically, and let me exemplify. My first encounter, real survivor of the Gulag, happened in fall 2002, like more than 20 years ago, when I went to the village of Deneshi in Zhytomyr Oblast to interview a woman by name of Maria Shanhutova, born in 1930. Then I worked for an international oral history project documenting stories of forced labor in Nazi Germany. After the interview was over, and I was, as we were like chatting over tea, she told me another story, what happened to her after she returned home. The young woman was with the Nazis because she actually volunteered to go to Germany as she, being pregnant, wanted to join her husband. As a result, she was sentenced to several years of imprisonment and ended up in a Gulag camp. I no longer remember all the details. Back then, I was inexperienced and didn't think of recording this part of her recollections. After all, that was an informal, and regrettably, I saw no value in it then. Still, her brief account of her years spent in the Gulag left a profound impression on me. Maria's stories was a true revelation for me and made me think for the first time the ambiguity of women's experiences as political prisoners. That stooped elderly woman remembered her captivity, a brown-beaten victim, but with pride and dignity. She spoke about how she, because of her quick-wittedness and useful gendered knowledge, ingeniously outsmarted a powerful soul crusher. For Maria herself, the fact that she managed to survive the camps despite all the horrors was her personal victory over the regime. After all her suffering, she did not present herself like a victim. Hers was the story of an individual who had won the. At that time, all I knew about the Gulag, and I was not specifically interested in that subject yet, was based on the writings by Solzhenitsyn, Shalamov, and Hinsberg, and my image of a prisoner was built on their gruesome stories of utmost victimization, degradation, and dehumanization. That is why Maria's story impressed me so much. For years afterwards, I kept thinking about the widespread perception of female political prisoners as simply powerless victims of political repressions who had no rights and whose experience was mainly a litany of suffering and loss, and how this such a one-sided and probably flawed way of seeing their lives. 10 years later, when I finally began to immerse myself in personal recollections of women who survived the Gulag, I not only found numerous affirmations of my doubts, but also discovered that the lives of women in camps were filled with everyday minor, acceptable, seemingly mundane, but very effective acts of resistance to the dehumanizing effects of the regime. The recollections of Ukrainian politicals testified to the fact that they had not just submitted meekly to their fates, but in the face of total control, disenfranchisement, and violence, had created their own secret world, one that was governed by the social norms, moral principles, and cultural practices they interiorized from their native culture. To my great surprise, I discovered that despite strict prohibitions and punishments, these women sang songs and created and marked Christian feast days, embroidered and painted, and tried to keep their barracks and clothing in order. What's more, in contrast to the law of the jungle that reigned the zone, as we all know from the canonical Gulag narratives, they took care of one another and supported those who were having the hard. Every time that they found a way to remain human in the face of inhumane conditions, to remain women, Ukrainians, and Christians, to preserve their identities and values, they actually beat the system. Their stories are the stories about the strength and the power of community, the stories of resilience and survival. That was a true revelation to me, as I realized how incomplete, inaccurate, and basically wrong our understanding of the human experiences in the Gulag is. How could that happen? Why is there such a gap of incongruence in our knowledge? Historians of the Gulag unanimously agree on the fact that ethnicity or nationality was crucial for convicts' informal status among prisoners and their chances to survive in camps. This is because a system of informal networks of prisoners' mutual assistance on ethnic or national membership, and so national identity is truly essential to understand survival in the Gulag. The Gulag studies, however, paid surprisingly little attention to research on various national groups of prisoners so far, and very few researchers endeavored to explore their features and distinctive survival strategies. Paradoxically, ethnicity or national affiliation or just nationality, as it is commonly addressed in memoirs, despite being a matter of vital importance in the Gulag, is still a marginal subject in the Gulag studies. Major works in history and anthropology of the Gulag almost exclusively on the testimonies of Russian or Russian-speaking survivors, drawing all kinds of conclusions from experiences of one national group and quite uncritically extrapolating them on the entire Gulag population, assuming the uniformity of any prisoner life. Even the groundbreaking study by Anne Applebaum that remains a model of anthropology of the Gulag, besides using a few hundreds of personal testimonies of the Gulag survivors, to include several memoirs of Ukrainians and Poles, even those available in English. The most comprehensive bibliography of the Gulag memoirs compiled by Sarah Young in 2016 listed hundreds of published in Russian, but does not include the majority of the published memoirs by Ukrainians, Estonians, Moldovan, and other memoirists, both in English and in national languages. The most recent scholarship in the history of Gulag keeps evaluating the progress of the field with relation to the seminal writings by Solzhenitsyn that are perceived as starting point of the Gulag studies. The Gulag studies are still revolving around the dominant narratives created by the Russians and representing their vision of the Gulag. Each and every scholar in the Gulag studies admits that men and women experienced the imprisonment differently, but again, very few to explore the gender aspects by examining women's lives in the camps. Moreover, even those few who tried to show what was special about women proved to be unable to go beyond the Russian narrative. For example, since the early 2000s, a number of books have been published in the West offering English translation of Gulag memoirs by women of different nationalities, age, and social background. However, the testimonies of Ukrainian women political prisoners are virtually absent in these publications, and the memoirs from other nations are also underrepresented. Of non-Russian women remain unknown to researchers. Those other nations and women are once again discriminated against, if not in the Gulag camps, then in the Gulag studies. Such Russocentric tunnel vision of the Gulag through the lens of the Russian survivors, representing only a portion of the Gulag population, poses a serious challenge to the entire field. This is even more true when we take into account the role of Ukrainians, women included, played in the famous camp uprising in Vorkuta and elsewhere. The events that have shaken the Gulag and effectively initiated the process of its downfall. My analysis of the Ukrainian Gulag memoirs proves that a failure to take into account specific experiences of women, prisoners of national origin, other than Russian, makes existing interpretation of human experiences in the Gulag inaccurate or even misleading. In my research, I show how studying the Ukrainian women's testimonies of surviving the Gulag allows us to discern the grassroots sources of prisoners' non-violent yet efficient everyday resistance, as defined by James Scott, to the acts of the camp regime. My study shows how women used their Ukrainianness as a standpoint from which they kept fighting against the Soviet regime while in captivity. It allows to detect how women instrumentalized their gendered skills, knowledge, habits, and practices as a platform for aid, counteracting the total dehumanization they were exposed to. By transgressing the Gulag's rules on a micro level, women basically questioned the very totality of that regime, its capability to establish comprehensive control over people. So even being the most deprived and oppressed is to sustain their social identities. Ukrainian women's stories of survival in the Gulag prove that despite that, what we know from Solzhenitsyn, there was room for human dignity, solidarity, empathy, and care in the Gulag. The lived experiences of women in the Gulag published Gulag masculine and Russocentric narratives by showing how gender and nation were entangled and mutually reinforcing in their survival strategies, as their national identity was profoundly gendered and their gender identity was rooted in national culture. So what happens to the Gulag when we go beyond the Russian canonic narratives? What if we applied the intersectional approach and look closer into stories of non-Russian female survivors? How do those other stories challenge the well-established understanding of the Gulag as an institution and our concept of resistance to the totalitarian regime? How may change our views of anti-colonial struggle back then and facilitate the process of decolonization of scholarship now? Ukrainian women's testimonies of living through the political imprisonment offer a new vantage point. These Gulag memoirs serve as a telling example, going beyond the anthrocentric and Russocentric paradigms through a systematic application of the intersectional approach, taking into account a variety of social characteristics, including gender and nation. We could perspective and draw a more complex and accurate picture of the Gulag. The Gulag studies would benefit greatly once we decolonize this research area. I'm afraid my time is up, so I will continue with the second part of my introductory remarks. Probably I will return later on within the discussion. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Oksana. Thank you so much for your, first of all, for your brilliant book and for your speech. One more time, presenting us your findings and your new approaches. So, yeah, we should return to your suggestions lately. And we go to our third speaker, Alex Averbukh. And Alex is an interdisciplinary scholar, poet, and translator who spoke engaged Eastern European and Jewish literature and cultures with a particular focus on Ukraine. And his research examines queerness, postcoloniality, propaganda, censorship, and visual and epistolary cultures. He has produced major exhibition, maybe, yes, and is completing a book on the Second World War era, Ukrainian forced labors and prisoners of war. So, Alex, please.
Thank you very much, Katerina. Thank you, Svetlana, for this series, and to all those involved in this initiative. I think it's important, especially during the war and aggression, to emphasize those topics that might seem less relevant. It is an honor to be part of such an panel with my esteemed colleagues, and I would like to begin with a proposition that may sound unusual. I will be talking about queerness and gender in the Ukrainian context, but not only as matter of identity or sexuality as we used to. It is a structural condition shaped by geography, language, and history. And Ukraine has long existed between empires in zones of overlap rather than stability. Its territories were shaped by layered sovereignties rather than singular political coherence, from Polish-Lithuanian law, Kazakh autonomy, Ottoman frontier zones, Habsburg administration, Russian and Soviet imperial rule. And these regimes did not simply replace one another. They overlapped, intersected, and left residues. Even religious belonging unsettled binary classification within Ukraine. The Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church preserved Byzantine liturgy while recognizing Rome, Eastern in ritual, Western in institutional alliance. It embodies synthesis rather than purity. Cities such as Lviv, Odessa, Kyiv functioned and still functioning as multilingual contact zones where Ukrainian, Polish, Yiddish, German, Russian, Armenian, Greek, and other communities coexisted and negotiated daily life across difference. In such conditions, identity was rarely singular. It was translated, adapted, recalibrated, and belonging was relational rather than absolute. In Ukraine, queerness begins not with sexuality, but with geography. Contemporary Ukraine increasingly attempts to define itself not through ethnic exclusivism, but through civic belonging. Ukrainian identity today is articulated less as bloodline and more as political commitment. Language, religion, and origin remain important, yet they no longer function as rigid gates of belonging in the way imperial systems once required. And this shift becomes especially visible in contrast with Russia's current ideological framework. Russian state rhetoric emphasizes national purity, traditional values, and civilizational homogeneity, framing difference as threat and plurality as moral decay. Ukraine, by contrast, is struggling, though unevenly and imperfectly, to articulate itself as a plural civic community. And in this context, multiplicity is not fragmentation, it is strength. The borderland condition that once marked Ukraine as unstable now becomes a resource. Its interethnic, multilingual, and interreligious histories offer a model of belonging not rooted in purity but in coexistence. Queerness understood as hybrid resistance, therefore aligns not with disintegration but with civic pluralism. Multiplicity is not a danger to the nation, it is the condition of its endurance. And this historical condition produced what I would call hybrid resistance, a mode of survival that resists imperial attempts to impose clarity, hierarchy, and fixed identity. Queerness here names the practice of inhabiting multiplicity, refusing purity, and sustaining ambiguity as endurance. Language itself reveals this structure. The phenomenon of surjik, often dismissed as incorrect or impure speech, blends Ukrainian, Russian, and other linguistic elements, and it violates grammatical and even national propriety. Yet precisely in this violation lies its meaning. Surjik embodies lived hybridity, and it refuses linguistic purification and exposes the fiction of cultural singularity. Empire classifies, borderlands blur. Yet colonial history complicates this narrative. Hybridity does not automatically produce tolerance. Being colonized does not always mean being innocent. Imperial domination imposed norms, but also taught societies to internalize them. Under imperial and Soviet rule, cultural legitimacy became tied to moral regulation, heteronormativity, and the policing of acceptable identities. Ukraine resisted empire politically while simultaneously learning its languages of exclusion socially. Across the Ukrainian canon, we encounter recurrent patterns of masking, silence, and biographical purification. Figures such as Grigory Skovoroda, Taras Shevchenko, Archangel Krymsky, Olga Kobylanska, Lesya Ukrainka, and many others reveal emotional and relational worlds that exceed normative frameworks. Yet scholarship often neutralizes these ambiguities in order to preserve cultural coherence. The canon remembers genius, but forgets vulnerability. The case study of Archangel Krymsky, whom I studied in depth, illustrates this clearly. At a major conference a couple of years ago dedicated to him, nearly 100 papers were presented, yet none addressed sexuality or intimacy, central to understanding his intellectual formation. Desire was dismissed as voyeurism reduced to peeping into the bedroom, as one scholar writes. And such reduction reflects what David Halperin calls homophobic truth. That is, the assumption that sexuality belongs only to private behavior rather than intellectual and cultural life. Silence here is not accidental, it is institutional. A similar mechanism appears in the case of filmmaker Serhiy Parajanov, arrested in 1973 under Soviet charges that included homosexuality. He was later, a couple of years ago, rehabilitated and officially exonerated. Yet his persecution was reframed primarily as political repression, while the queer dimension remained unacknowledged. Rehabilitation restored the artist, but erased the mechanism of repression. And this omission is itself political. By translating queer persecution into general dissidence, post-Soviet memory sanitizes history. What is restored is the artist, but not the difference that made him vulnerable. These tensions persist in contemporary Ukraine. The country today navigates competing forces: Soviet nostalgia, ethno-nationalism, European integration, and the ongoing struggle to decolonize. Independence requires not only sovereignty over territory, but rethinking the boundaries of belonging. Last year, if you might remember, during the Pride Month in June, the Ukrainian National Union of Writers, a state-funded cultural institution, issued a statement condemning LGBTQ solidarity as anti-family and anti-national. The rhetoric echoed global and Russian anti-gender narratives, presenting queer visibility as ideological threat rather than cultural participation. Some writers responded with resignations and public protest. What was being resisted by the organization was not only sexuality, but hybridity itself. And imperial systems depend on clear classifications. Borderland cultures survive through ambiguity. At the legislative level, tensions remain visible in Ukraine. Efforts to introduce registered partnerships have faced resistance, leaving LGBTQ soldiers without legal recognition of their partners despite their participation in national defense. War intensifies these contradictions. Russia's invasion destabilizes imperial hierarchies that long sought to homogenize Ukrainian identity. Queer Ukrainians have become more visible, particularly through military participation and volunteer networks. But visibility produces a paradox. Recognition arrives through sacrifice rather than citizenship. Queer Ukrainians are often allowed to die for the nation before fully living within it. War accelerates visibility, but unfortunately delays equality. In occupied territories, repression takes another form. Feminist organizations and LGBTQ initiatives are among the first targets there. Educational systems impose rigid gender norms, public queer presence completely disappears. Occupation governs intimacy as much as territory. Empire redraws not only borders, but acceptable forms of desire. At the same time, European integration functions less as geography than as temporal horizon. Europe represents a future imagined beyond both Soviet past and imperial present. Debates about gender and sexuality, therefore, become debates about historical direction. Yet decolonization is neither immediate nor painless. It is a long and uneven process. It requires confronting internalized hierarchies, inherited exclusions, and the habits learned under empire. Decolonization unsettles not only structures of domination, but also structures of comfort. Today we speak about gender, femininity, and queerness, decoloniality, and many other urgent topics. And it is not incidental that these questions are being articulated by voices historically positioned at the margins. Transformation often begins not at the center of cultural authority, but at its edges. The expansion of who is allowed to interpret the nation remains incomplete. The very fact that gender and queerness are still framed as specialized or even controversial reminds us that liberation unfolds unevenly. War also threatens the fragile archives through which queer histories survive. Letters, marginal writings, unpublished manuscripts, coded intimacies. Queer history often exists as residue, and war places that residue at risk of complete disappearance. And for this reason, I propose thinking of Ukrainian culture through a queer genealogy, a lineage persistently present in linguistic hybridity, literary ambiguity, emotional negotiation, and strategies of adaptation. Queering the canon does not impose theory onto Ukraine. It reveals mechanisms already embedded within its survival. Ukraine's historical condition might be described as a form of national impossibility, a nation repeatedly forced to negotiate visibility through opacity and adaptation. And to decolonize Ukraine then is not to purify identity, but to protect multiplicity. Ukraine survives not despite its hybridity, but because of it. And its queerness, understood as hybrid resistance born from multicultural borderland existence, challenges both imperial homogenization and nationalist purification. Survival in the borderlands has always required plurality rather than certainty, translation rather than purity. And decolonization, however incomplete, begins precisely there. So, and let me end more directly. If we accept that queerness and hybridity are central to Ukrainian history, then their continued marginalization within scholarship is not accidental. It is a methodological conservatism. For decades, archives existed, texts existed, lives existed. However, questions were not always asked. Silence was not absence, it was a choice. To decolonize Ukraine, therefore, requires more than political solidarity. It requires intellectual risk, rewriting syllabi, reframing canonical figures, abandoning the comfort of coherent national narratives. And we must integrate these voices into every course, not because diversity is desirable, but because omission produces false knowledge. Public engagement carries the same responsibility. Ukraine is still too often described through binaries inherited from empire, civilized or backward, European or peripheral, traditional or modern. Yet Ukraine's defining feature is precisely its refusal of such binaries. If scholarship continues to privilege clarity over complexity, it becomes as accomplice to homogenization. Decolonization is uncomfortable because it forces us to recognize that the margins were never marginal. They were simply ignored. This task before us is not to add new voices to an existing narrative, but to accept that the narrative itself must change. And to complete, some may ask whether this is the right time today and nowadays in general to discuss gender and queerness while wars in plural rage and global crisis deepen. But history shows that the policing of gender, the enforcement of traditional values, and the suppression of plurality are not side effects of totalitarianism. They are its foundations. When regimes seek to restore empire, they begin by defining who is normal, who is moral, and who is allowed to belong. And if Ukraine's struggle is about sovereignty, then it is also about the kind of society that sovereignty will produce. The defense of multiplicity is not an academic exercise. It is a refusal to allow crisis to justify exclusion. And there is no better time to insist that plurality is non-negotiable. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Alex. Thank you again for highlighting the complexity of the decolonized subject and the, for example, ambiguity involved in applying the categories we're accustomed to, such as identity, for example, and yeah, especially from my side for drawing attention to the reactivation of silence as an integral part of colonial structures and as a strategy. Thank you, and we'll return to your report later. And now we are moving to our final speaker, Tamara Martsenyuk. And Tamara is an associate professor of sociology at the University of Kyiv Mohyla Academy, and her research focuses on gender, protest participation, women's access to military service, and she led their groundbreaking Invisible Battalion studies, which examine gender equality in the Ukrainian armed forces and the status of female veterans. Her work offers a vital sociological perspective on women's lived experience of war, care work, political agency, and structural inequality in contemporary Ukraine. Tamara, please, you're welcome.
Thanks a lot. I'm very grateful for inviting me here, and I'll try to present briefly my ideas about our topic and my research results. First of all, I'd like to mention that I am public sociologist, and you will probably see this from my research results, and gender scholar. And because of this and my research on women and military, I ended up to be a liberal feminist as far as my largest project, Invisible Battalion, is about liberal feminist ideas of visibility of women in the armed forces of Ukraine. And with my colleagues, our research team, we study more than 10 years women's involvement in the Russo-Ukrainian war. I personally have 2 years experience of being refugee scholar abroad, mainly in Europe, but visiting a number of countries. And my major idea was and is to make Ukrainian studies more visible in this area studies. And actually, living abroad, I experienced mainly support and understanding from international colleagues and feminists, but I will mention also a bit about transnational feminist solidarity and which challenges I see there. As for my studies, it's about women's resistance in war, and I pay attention not only on victimhood, that is expected from the theories and studies on gender and war, gender and nation. Also, I do research on different forms of resistance, but mainly on military one. And we show legacy of resistance since the beginning of since the annexation and of Crimea and occupation of Donbass, and so we studied 12 years of war in Ukraine, and actually what we tried to pay attention as far as we worked with a very challenging institution of security and defense sector, that our major values are connected with dignity as a result of a revolution of dignity, and also professionalism. And we recognize that armed forces of Ukraine as a quite a large labor market currently also for Ukrainian women. And of course, we pay attention to the role of grassroots activism and civil society. And actually, this big project, Invisible Battalion, is driven by military women. Maria Berlinska, who was student at my university of Kyiv-Mohyla Academy, who came and asked for help to do research about gender discrimination of women fighting in the so-called anti-terrorist operation in the front line on combat positions, but not officially recognized by state. Maria was by herself doing a reconnaissance, but this military occupation was not by then recognized for women. So 10 years ago, we did our first sociological study with metaphorical title Invisible Battalion. And as a result of the study, we presented results. The larger advocacy campaign started. It was a documentary movie. You could check our webpage. We do have a movie about 6 women, but also about post-traumatic stress disorder. And for last years, you could see the list of our studies. There were also, we had study about female veterans, on the issue of sexual harassment in the military, on women's access to military education. Also, we've been working with gender-sensitive military leadership. We developed online course on gender equality and combating sexual harassment in the military that we launched just before full-scale invasion. But despite of this, still you could see that it's quite popular, and mainly Ukrainian men who study in the military institutions, but not only them, they have this course. So actually, and we do continue working with the topic of gender equality implementation and women's visibility in the security and defense sector. And despite all challenges, we continue working also with issue of sexual harassment in the Ukrainian military, very problematic and very difficult to work with, especially in the conditions of full-scale invasion, where such problematic topics, they used to be perceived as the so-called secondary ones. But at the same time, when presenting on different events, we also talk about transnational feminist solidarity. And I just want to explain one case. You could see I have paper in the Journal of the European Society of Women in the Theological Research. I was invited on their annual event to prepare, where I was doing keynote speech about results of my research about the project of Invisible Battalion, our successes, challenges, what happened. And actually, I faced the problem that Western feminists, mainly from Germany, but not only, who are also LGBTQ friendly, and they are theologists, they were pacifists, and they were very critical towards the ideas of this project. And organizers invited me to write this paper where I explained my ideas, and I developed also and used this concept of informed solidarity and understanding, because just only solidarity is important, but it's also, you should consider that you may criticize studies while sitting in the comfortable sofa in your country, because you can't visit Ukraine due to the constant shelling, and this was international conference in Lviv. At the same time, you should at least read a bit more on Ukraine and try to listen more, to use proper terminology, to understand the positionality of people, and it's also important, especially in the area studies, to provide voices for those who are so-called from the field where you survived the war. At the same time, I would like to cite the paper of also this the person from this conference, Dr. Helen Zordrager, and she wrote article Gender, War and Religion, Feminist Perspective on Pathways to Just Peace in the Journal of Feminist Theology. And she proposed 5 principles for feminist political theology on war and peace, and among which I think the one that is very important, nothing for Ukraine without the voices of Ukrainian women. And this topic of these voices and the right to resist Ukrainian Women Feminist Manifesto and others, they've been discussed already for all these years of full-scale invasion, but it's I would say it's still important to mention them and to explain the situations that I want to read and just finalize here. As a public sociologist and gender scholar, I would like to say that conducting research on gender and war during more than 10 years of war is not an easy task. From one hand, you have an opportunity to be in a real empirical field while communicating with military women and men, NGOs, policymakers, educators. It's not only a cabinet study where you work with theories or media information. It's a very empirical reality that results also despite the challenges in changes in policies, because still a situation of gender discrimination with military women is improving. It's incremental track, step by step, and very also bureaucratic work that is daily, that is being done daily. But on the other hand, you're constantly involved in studying and helping your respondents, hearings of your interviews, and you don't have time and energy to reflect this empirical data into theories. And it's very difficult because, of course, there is a pool of literature on gender and war, gender and nation building. It's very critical literature with very big stress on, first of all, victimhood of Ukrainian women. And it's very difficult to develop this series, to turn this empirical material into theoretical debates, especially during the times of the full-scale war. So I do hope that when we will have peace, victory, we will have more time also to, I would say, to make some input into the colonial series and into studies of gender and war. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for this perfect timing, first of all, and for your project, because it is a vivid illustration that even in times of war, there is obviously space and necessity not only to raise questions of gender equality and sexual integrity, but also to address other uncomfortable and courage questions. So thank you so much. And right now, I have an opportunity to open a chat. If you still have questions for all our participants, for all our brilliant panelists, you can address them in chat. So just use our chat. And right now, I can open our discussion between our 4 panelists. So have you any questions for each other? So do you want to address something, suggestions, questions, anything, you can do it right now. So please, you are welcome, because I have a lot of questions and I'm privileged to ask them maybe later. But right now is your time.
May I ask a question? Yeah, I have a question for Alex, but maybe for all participants of the panel. And it's a question that has been with me for quite a while as someone living in Poland and observing artistic work by Ukrainian diaspora artists, which in Warsaw are some of them are quite radical and queer and intensely ambivalent about Ukrainian patriotic duty in a very complicated way. And I was really relieved to hear Alex theorize this, that actually complexity and ambivalence is what keeps Ukraine alive. But my question is, could you bring this a little bit more down to earth? Is this really so? In other words, is there a strand of Ukrainian resistance against Russia that strives to muffle or censor this kind of complexity in the name of patriotic clarity? Or is the hybrid, queer, open-ended kind of thinking about identity really the mainstream? I'm asking also because I think Ukraine is the only country or the only cultural space which has not been responsive to the Russian and global anti-gender rhetorics. But I may be wrong. I don't know. It just seems to me that that's the one place where it won't work as an identity building rhetoric, because they are the colonizers and they bring the anti-gender frame with them. So I'm just curious, how widespread is your way of thinking? That's a short way to put it. Thank you.
Thank you, Agnieszka. Well, as I stated in my presentation, my voice is quite marginal, as well as yours. So it's definitely not widespread. But I think that, and I emphasize this imbalance or these two polars that Ukrainian society is moving between. From one side, this horizon of liberation of European integrity that also culturally, socially, but also legally requires providing rights to minorities, including sexual minorities. So this is something that comes from above, from the government as practical means to integrate Ukraine into the Western context, Western frameworks. But there is also this quite conservative milieu in Ukraine, and not only I'm talking also about scholars, and I mentioned the scholarship, but I also published quite a bit on queer topics, especially on Hatan Krimsky gave presentations, and these are not received always positively. So not the very topic of talking about Krimsky as homosexual, but as framing these canon as somehow dependent on in relation with the topics of same-sex desire that are everlasting for Ukrainian culture, Ukrainian literature. I'm a literary historian. So I would not say that this is why I was less optimistic and was more talking from within, because I am struggling with these with colleagues, and I like this struggle. I like these negotiations because they visibly uncover what we should work with. But I think that Ukraine has a long way until the full recognition or even partial recognition of its own involvement in the repression of these voices, because we talk always about Ukraine as a colonial subject, but this colonialism was also often performed from within, since the Russian imperial rule, Soviet and current. So I do see it, even this discourse, as very much hybrid, and I'm happy about it. And what differs from Russia is that there are such attempts to attack the diversity talks or events or publications related to sexuality, gender, but there is always a forum for reflections. For example, there was a debate on the admission of a new student to the Ukrainian Catholic University, and there was the rejection was motivated allegedly by sharing some LGBTQ stuff on social media, and she was rejected to be placed in the dormitory, or but this event was immediately in the news and in public debate. So this is a very positive sign that the society is ready to discuss it and to approach it critically. Thank you. I have a question. Actually, I have a question to Oksana, whose research I admire, use, and model my own research on her research. But so I had this question for many years, and now I have the opportunity to ask it publicly. So in Gulag scholarship, and also in scholarship on Ostarbeiters, which is closer to what I do, same-sex desire or even intimate same-sex bonds are often marginal or even absent. And in such homosocial environments as prisons, do you see this as a gap in sources, a methodological hesitation, or maybe a broader tendency to purify the narrative of repression by focusing only on political victimhood? In other words, there is no queer component in research on, for example, Gulag, women who were sent to the Gulag, although it must be there. It's just inevitable. So I would be grateful for your reflection on that.
Yeah, thank you, Alex. Yeah, that's true. This is a gap in the Gulag studies, and we don't have substantial research on homosexuality in the camps and prisons, although we know from some memoirs, predominantly from the Russian ones, that there was this kind of subculture of same-sex relationships among women as well, but mostly among women of the criminal prisoners, mostly. So I would say there are different factors. On the one hand, for quite a long time, nobody actually bothered, to explore this aspect of everyday life of a prisoner in a camp, like any other aspect of everyday life. Let me say that such a traditional topic as, let's say, religious practices were not researched until recently. Only recently a book appeared on that topic. So it's not specifically like to purify or to cleanse this homosexual aspect, but just any aspect of what concerns the everyday lives of the prisoners. But on the other hand, this is also the problem of the sources, because oftentimes the survivors did not speak much about that aspect of their life. So they even if there was something in their own experience, they would keep it private and they would skip that topic or just mention it in passing. Especially in the Ukrainian memoirs, we can hardly find anything sexuality at all. So the problem was that when the time came to ask questions and to interview the Gulag survivors, many of them were in a quite advanced age, a senior age, and in poor health. And the interviewers actually didn't do a great job asking questions about their bodies, about their sexuality, about any aspect of the intimacy. So if the question is not asked in any way, the people would probably skip it. So that's the gap. I don't think somehow make for this absence of the materials, although I suspect that something could be found in the archives, but those archives, we have no access whatsoever to those documents, and probably won't have it for foreseeable future. I myself, I would rather not ask a question for another panelist, take the opportunity to reflect a little bit on a question which somehow I find intriguing in the chat from Natalia Zaletuk about this image of witch, which women would adopt while in the military, calling themselves witches, right? We have popular phenomenon of combat witches in Ukraine right now, and we had those night witches as a aviation unit in the Second World War. I would say this is something which is specifically, I would say, when women try to justify their militancy, they look for or some symbol from a traditional culture, and they come up with this image of a witch, which used to be the only character within the traditional culture, with spectrum of social roles allocated for women, which was the only probably person who were entitled to inflict violence, to inflict, and so on. So whenever women try to justify their own right and capability, engage in direct violence, they look for this kind of image use as a metaphor for their activities. And I would say it makes sense, especially if we keep in mind that the very word witch comes from, in Ukrainian language, women, means like the one who knows, the wise woman. And oftentimes, exactly the lonely, the single women who were elderly, who were independent, who were autonomous, living separately, having their own household and so on, were ladies, right? So whenever a woman is strong enough to be independent and especially carry the weapon and engage in violence, she would be called a witch. And this way to turn to flip that narrative from a negative one into a positive one, to become a helpful witch, a useful witch, a good witch, is something which it's not a matter of my approval, of course, but I can understand why this image speaks to those women, and they use it gladly. Yeah, that's it.
Okay, thank you so much. And maybe I should address some questions from the chat. Yes. First of all, one of them is addressed to Agnieszka Graff. Given the West favor to gasp in between, I'm sorry. Yeah, you can find this question by yourself, but anyway, in between status of post-Soviet women, should Ukrainian feminists shift focus from seeking Western validation? Would it be more productive to prioritize decolonial alliances with other post-Soviet societies that Madina Tolstanova advocates? I want to read all the questions and then you receive an opportunity to answer all of them. Question from Katerina Ostrovska. Dear all, I represent the field of the futurist studies, and for science, decolonization and auto-tourism are on the agenda of the futurists globally. Could you recommend experts who work in the intersection of Russian colonialism, gender, and future studies, especially? Thank you. Anyone who knows about this question, so you could answer after this. And other question about links of publications, so you can provide them below. And also, maybe that's all, or maybe not. I remember one question from Alexei Ulko. So question about how to reach out and ensure support from feminists in Central Asia. So please, let's start with Agnieszka Graff, and then we go on. Thank you.
Thank you for that question. I want to keep away from the temptation of giving advice to anyone, especially people, fighting for survival. I don't think I'm in the position of telling Ukrainian feminists what to do. But as far as I can see, that to some extent is already happening. So, for instance, I know that Teresa Hendel, who is probably the most bitter voice among those who are complaining about the obliviousness of Western feminists to Ukraine and to Russia's imperialism, that she's actually involved in precisely such networking. And so that is happening. But I also think that we cannot abandon the transnational conversation that is feminism, nor should we abandon the decolonial frame to a kind of obscurantist, far left, anti-Western way of thinking that is oblivious to Russia. I think that we need to keep talking and we need to keep pressing, and that is also happening. So, for instance, at Gender, the European Association for Gender Studies has had a number of confrontations around this issue, which may be frustrating to Ukrainians and Poles, and it's actually not just Ukrainians; it's everyone from the region, I think. But I think increasingly, there are people in the West who are hearing it. And, of course, Russian expansionism doesn't stop on the Polish-Ukrainian border. The ambitions are much greater than that. And I think it's not just a feminist conversation, it's a European conversation about security and, militarization versus peace. It's a big political debate that needs to be happening. If we keep talking only among ourselves, we may have a more fruitful conversation intellectually, but we do need to address a broader audience, I think. So I think both, in a way, both are happening. But I'm still waiting for someone to say that I'm wrong and that there is actually a decolonial feminism in the West that is fully aware of Russia's imperialism. I'm actually quite sad to not be confronted. So please feel free.
Also, feel free to continue this discussion and also confront it or not, or maybe answer some questions from chat. Yeah, please go on.
If I may just say a few words, like in continuation to what Agnieszka just said, because I totally agree, we cannot afford just to stay away from the general conversation. And, we need this meaningful dialogue. We need to present our case. I'm not sure whether the Western feminist scholarship would embrace Ukrainian story or Ukrainian case with open arms now or later on. I understand that reluctance because Ukrainian women's history, for instance, presents an awkward case for the mainstream feminist theories because it doesn't fit them neatly on many occasions and represent a kind of challenge, and it's very uncomfortable. Well-established theory doesn't stand the test on the ground, and we have many examples with Ukrainian history when it comes to the Ukrainian folk culture, which is being undeniably patriarchal, nevertheless created some room for and appreciated noticeable elements of women's rights and autonomy, and especially before the Russian Empire took over the Ukrainian lands and attempted to impose this Domostroy rule here. And the Ukrainian women's movement in the early 20th century, besides being clearly based on feminist foundations, has willfully prioritized the national cause over the agenda of feminist political struggle. And the leaders of women's organizations, being the members of the Polish parliament at the time, have developed the original type of feminist activism, which Marta Bohachevsky aptly named pragmatic feminism, a community-based work focused more on addressing everyday issues of common women rather than on political activities and feminist awareness raising. So instead of preaching ideological theories, they worked to increase women's capacity and stress influence on the ground. But of course, in times when Ukrainians were a stateless nation, Ukrainian feminists could not afford to stay aside the national project. But on the other side, they did invest in women. So how to deal with that situation, that theory of gender and nation and so on. And I already told about, Ukrainian women political prisoners in the Gulag who actually flipped the meaning of normative femininity, which is generally regarded as a negative thing in feminist scholarship, as something restrictive that serves to sustain gender hierarchies and so on and so forth. But then in the Gulag was actually instrumentalized and provided women with a platform for grassroots agency and equipped women with some tools for resistance. And Ukrainian feminists, of course, of all kinds, as Tamara just mentioned it, including the leftist and anarchist and pacifist, suddenly turned into nationalist and militarist when the Russian Federation launched all-out war against Ukraine. But that's also obvious that how could we possibly remain neutral and refuse to support the military when the genocidal war posed a real threat to the very existence of Ukraine. So we cannot just afford to stay aside or to demonize our army or our defense forces, which is, by the way, a unique people army, because the civilian conscripts make the absolute majority of that army. So it does not mean that we abandoned our feminist agenda. We know that this year, the International Women's Day will be marked by Women's March in protest of the new draft of a civil code that jeopardizes women's rights. So we try to keep that balance between the feminist agenda, but also we remain the Ukrainian citizens fighting for the country, for the freedom, including the freedom and the gender equality. So I would say Ukrainians are so uncomfortable in many ways with their, history, and they're, permanently challenging the established theories which were developed in a different context for different purposes, and now it's not that easy to revise them or to admit work in certain situations. Thanks. Sorry for being so long.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And dear Tamara, maybe you can continue this conversation. Thank you, especially regarding the chat questions.
Yes, I see there is a new question a controversial question. How do you think the fact that women can leave the country and are not called up for military service affects the image of women in Ukraine? Are there any studies? And actually, I would say that yes, according to Ukrainian legislation, there is no obligatory draft for women, but still women are serving mainly on contract basis, and for them it's not easy to get into armed forces, and we do have around 70,000 or even now more, even 90,000 women in the armed forces and around 5,000 in the front lines in combat positions. And actually, I would say that despite the fact that also millions of women, they were forced to become refugees with children and elderly, the international audience quite aware of the fact that around 10-15% of the armed forces of Ukraine are women, and the number is increasing. And I think that due to this fact, it's quite often in media, women have quite positive image. There are studies on this, legal one. I think even there are authors of the studies among our audience on some legal issues of this restrictions. And of course, currently, as far as there is lack of traditional male male resource to enter armed forces, more and more debates how to integrate more women, despite the fact that according to results of public opinion surveys, this idea of so-called Israeli style of army is not popular at all. Vast majority of Ukrainians, they support contract-based professional armed forces with equal opportunities for women and men, but of course it's very difficult to implement, especially in the full-scale invasion. But there are studies about also man and masculinity and marginalization of men due to the fact that according to this legislation, majority of men can't leave the country and some escape and they are marginalized. And in men studies and in refugee studies, you could find also some issues, some papers about this, despite the fact that actually the part of gender studies as so-called critical men studies, it's even less popular compared to women's or LGBT studies when we talk about the Russo-Ukrainian war. And I would say that, of course, we need more, but it's because in general, I think in our area studies, critical men studies are not very popular. So, but it's one of the, of course, the issues that there are a number of debates what to do with this, also with this legislation, and how to integrate both women and men in the armed forces that is more professional and that have values of this dignity, and of course we fight we struggle for dignity for all, not only women but men and LGBT plus. Also, it's another issue, and there are also studies on this, and we do have LGBT military, as already Alex mentioned, and of course it's the right also for the citizenship, so-called, and is important in this aspect. So probably I will stop here.
Thank you so much. And Alex, your final, but unfortunately extremely short reply, please.
I'm not sure what to reply, but I see this last question about the ethical accounts of addressing these questions. And thanks for this question. It's indeed difficult, but I will try to be short. I think that the first step is to resist the assumption that critique and solidarity, they are the opposites. They are not. In moments of anti-colonial struggle, there is understandable a desire for unity, clarity, moral coherence, but unity that depends on silence is fragile. So I think that the challenges is not whether to critique, but how to do this responsibly in ways that remain grounded in solidarity with the anti-colonial struggle while refusing to idealize it.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And maybe it's time to finalize our great panel, I suppose. So as we came to the end of our discussion, I would like to sincerely thank all of our speakers, Agnieszka Graff, Oksana Kis, Alex Averbukh, and Tamara Martsenyuk, for such thoughtful, nuanced, powerful contributions. And also thank you, our audience, for engagement and your questions. And yes, your presence and participation make these discussions meaningful and sensible. So, and we will continue this series, and we are already preparing our next panel, which will take place at the end of May, I hope. And we hope you will join us again as we expand this conversation further. So thank you all for being with us today, and yeah, good evening or maybe good day.